Mr. William C. Spicer Jr. has come in to do an oral history about Groton, and we would like to welcome you.
In the early 1980s, a group of residents and the public library in Groton, Connecticut, set out to record an oral history of their town.
If you would just sign on and tell us
Thank
what your
you very
name,
much
rank, and serial number is.
The goal of the project was to permanently preserve the memories of the town's older citizens.
Thank you very much for your kind welcome, and I am William C. Spicer Jr., 930 Shinnecossett Road, Groton, Connecticut, born February 11th, 1913. And from there, what do you want?
The January 10, 1984 conversation with William Spicer was one of more than 60 interviews recorded over the course of 4 years.
When did you come to Groton? And we know
I was born in Groton in the old yacht club building before it burned down, which was my grandfather's house.
In 1995, 11 years after this recording was made, Spicer was found stabbed to death on his Christmas tree farm. He was 82. In the 23 years since, no one has been arrested for Mr. Spicer's murder. From the Day in New London, Connecticut, I'm Carlos Virgen, and this is Case Unsolved. Here's reporter Erica Moser with part 1 of the story of William Spicer Jr.
William C. Spicer Jr., who was known to family and friends as Bill, was the king of hearts in the deck of cards produced by the state starting in 2010. The state distributed the cards in Connecticut prisons with the hope of generating tips and leads in cases of unsolved homicides, along with missing persons and unidentified remains. The average age of the victims in the 4 decks that the state distributed was about 32 and a half. At 82 years old, Bill Spicer was the 3rd oldest person depicted on a card.
I mean, with the Spicer case, I can't say different than other cases.
Heather Beauchamp is the Groton Town Police Detective, currently in charge of the Spicer case.
He was an older man. He was 82 years old. You know, he owned his own business. He was very into nature, trees, with the tree farm. So that's where he really, most of his life reflected that. He was a family guy and a business guy.
I'm just making up terms here, but he wouldn't be what we consider high risk.
Assistant State's Attorney Krista Baker is the prosecutor assigned to the Spicer case.
You know, he's not out on the streets. He's not out, out late. He's not involved in the drug scene. He wouldn't be what you would typically characterize as somebody who you'd think would be high risk for a homicide, a victim of a homicide.
Bill Spicer was also a prominent member of the Groton community. He was active on several local boards and commissions, and he was moderator and deacon at his church. He had also been recognized for his work with the Rotary Club.
Bill Spicer's obituary in the Day described him as, quote, a member of one of the oldest and best-known families in the region. The Spicer's family's history in the area dates back to 1640. Since then, many members have been active in the civic and business life of the community. 6 died while defending Fort Griswold from the British in 1781.
Mr. Spicer was a true swamp Yankee.
John Verone is a retired officer with the town of Groton Police Department and was one of the detectives on the Spicer case.
He is a self-made man. He was a very compassionate person. He cared about the town and the city of Groton. He believed in being involved in the local civics. He was a thrifty person, and he was, again, a very good businessman.
This description of Bill Spicer as a classic New England Yankee was something we heard from a few people we talked to who knew him. And you can really get a sense of that listening to the oral history recording from 1984, between all of the historical knowledge of Groton that he has and all of the old yarns he has about decades past.
My great-granddad, of course, was a real honest-to-God sea captain, same as my Uncle John.
He spoke for nearly 2 hours with Gretchen Hammerstein, who was the director of the Groton Public Library at the time, and with Henry Haley, who was active in town politics. It's interesting listening to this, partially because of all the different topics they reach, and you can also tell that Gretchen Hammerstein is kind of the straight woman in this, that she's trying to get the other two back on track.
Bluff Point itself has changed over the years, too.
Can we just finish on birds a minute before we go to books?
You're still sticking with birds.
All right.
The other two are kind of veering off and going down memory lane.
That was in the horse and buggy days. in a manner of speaking?
Well, I think my grandmother had the first Abbott that she ever owned, which was shortly after John Avery's one-cylinder Cadillac, and everybody else was in horse and buggies.
And they just keep going off and talking about the hurricane of 1938.
38 hurricane cut through the sand spit to Bushy Point, both out at the end, but also right up next to Bluff Point. A lot of people seem to have forgotten.
And education issues in town, how things have changed.
The one-room school had one teacher teaching 8 grades.
That's right.
Geography, history, spelling, penmanship, arithmetic, you name it.
They used to teach spelling, Henry, too.
Right?
Remember when they taught spelling?
That's right. And you know,
And people could spell.
And talking about outhouses.
you had outdoor accommodations.
Of course.
Uh,
Spotlessly clean.
pretty grim in this kind of weather.
Spotlessly clean.
And how the schools were back then.
Now, we used to spend a lot of time on seesaws. I don't see very many. Now they buy them and put them on school grounds, but we used to catch a fence rail somewhere, probably off of some poor farmer's fence that wanted it there. I don't remember where we got it, but we got a fence rail, and we used to stick it across the top of the fence up to Pleasant Valley, Horskunk Lane School, and we used to sit on the seesaw. And there was seesaw times and marbles times and baseball times and football times and times for
It was
digging
interesting
little
hearing about a lot of
strips
the
down
places
the
that I've
playgrounds.
driven around a lot or visited, one of them being Bluff Point. It's a really popular spot in Groton for people to go for a walk, go for a hike, walk their dogs, go to the beach, go fishing.
So you know what Bluff Point was like. It was a farm. It was a working farm. It had slaves. It had the stone walls there, which were largely built with slave labor.
He was talking a bit about Pleasant Valley School, which closed after the 2016-17 school year for budgetary reasons, and Pleasant Valley Lane, and how it was called Skunk Lane at one
You know
point.
why it was called Skunk Lane?
Tell us, I know, but go ahead.
You know, Well, it was called Skunk Lane because the toll house that sat over on the corner down where the, Whipple's organ place is over there, collected toll on the toll road. And by going around the Pleasant Valley and the Gunjawamp Road now, so-called, past Clarence Latham's place, you came back over by Canonchik's gas station, which was on the other side of the toll house, and you avoided paying toll, which was called skunking around the toll. And that's why that's Skunk Lane.
Bill was great. He had a great personality. I really liked the guy.
Paul Duarte served with Bill Spicer on the City of Groton's Inland Wetlands and Conservation Commission.
You know, I mean, his family's been here for like ever. So, you know, there was a certain swagger, I would say, that comes along with that, and rightfully so. But his death was a big loss. I'd have to say that was a big loss to the community. I mean, just the breadth of knowledge that the man had.
And it was possible to drive a herd of cows or sheep across from Pine Island, down Bushy Point, and up to the Merritt Farm, and into town, wherever you happened to go.
You know, where things were, what things looked like. You know, I mean, he was older than me, you know, considerably older than me. And so, you know, he had that history, plus he had the family history.
And my grandfather used to run that little route to build wall for Merritt, which paid, I believe, $1 a rod or something like that.
You'd see him around town, you know, and stuff like that. He was always out and about, you know, very personable, you know. You know, later on in life, his wife became very dependent upon him.
Doris Spicer, Bill's wife of 60 years, had recently suffered a stroke and had developed Alzheimer's disease.
So they were always together. He wouldn't leave her at home or anything like that. So everywhere he went, she went.
He was very devoted to his wife.
Again, retired detective John Verone.
You know, as you know, she was ill at the time, and every day he took her to lunch at BB's. He spent so much time with her. It was an undying love there.
They were frequent customers at BB Dairy, which is one of those restaurants that is no longer around, but people still love to reminisce about. So there were multiple locations of BB Dairy. The one that would have been closest to the Spicers was in the Groton Shoppers Mart on Route 1, where the Big Y grocery store stands today.
They'd be there for lunch every day, because Doris wasn't cooking anymore.
Linda Penault was a neighbor of the Spicers on Shanticosset Road.
So they would go there for lunch just about every day. They loved them. And I used to get a kick out of it if we were doing our supper over there or going over later for ice cream or something. We'd always stop and talk with them, of course, and Bill would, and I'd say, "What did you have for supper tonight?" And Doris would say, "I really wasn't hungry. We had hot fudge sundaes." And that was like the biggest, her face would just light up because she got away with having ice cream for supper.
Linda said that Bill was a very private person. She remembered one time before she was hired to be caretaker for Doris when Bill approached her and asked if she could sit with Doris for a few hours while he went out. So Linda did, and she said she and Doris just had tea or something like that. And she remembers being struck about how difficult it must have been for Bill to ask her to do this. One, because he's such a private person, and also the difficulty of Doris's deteriorating memory. But even when she was thinking about Doris's memory getting worse, Linda still would light up when she would talk about the loving relationship that Bill and Doris Spicer had.
Oh, they were the most loving, fabulous couple. And I told my husband, we were a very close couple as well, and Bill always said, "I see Doris and me in you and your husband." They never went anywhere without holding hands. They were never like huggy-kissy, but never went anywhere without holding hands. And it wasn't because he was protecting her, it was just because that's the way it was,
Eventually, Bill Spicer hired Linda Penault to work as a caretaker for Doris, a role she continued in after the murder.
For her personally, coping with Bill Spicer's death was very hard at first, in part because of her relationship with Doris, that she was still caring for Doris after Bill Spicer's death, and along with how difficult the grieving process must have already been, she's now dealing with someone who has Alzheimer's, which makes explaining this all that much more difficult.
On occasion, she'd say to me during the day, Bill, kind of like calling for him because where is it? Why isn't he around? And of course that's going to happen to anybody that lost a husband. And I'd say, "No, Doris, Bill isn't here." And we'd sit down and I'd hold her hand and we'd talk. I never told her how anything happened, but I said, "Doris, are you aware that Bill has gone to heaven?" And she would cry. The tears would just come down her face, And I says, "Doris, but he's in a good place." I says, and it happened very fast. I never, ever told her what happened. Never. I would never do that to my sweet lady.
I hate to say this, but it was probably a blessing on her condition that she didn't have to suffer as much as the rest of the family did in the loss. And that, how cruel that sounds, it's true, because she didn't have to wake up every day reliving that.
Family members said that the day of Bill Spicer's death, he had left home around 1:30 in the afternoon to get a haircut. He went to John's barbershop, which still exists but is now known as Wayne's Barbershop. And in the days after the murder, the Day spoke with the barber who cut Bill Spicer's hair, and he said that Mr. Spicer was pretty quiet during his 10-minute visit. After the haircut, Bill Spicer went to go see his friend and cousin, Philip Tuttle, who owned Tuttle's Nursery and Garden Center next door. And this was also common for him to go visit Philip Tuttle. And after the murder, Philip Tuttle told the Day that his cousin, that Bill Spicer, didn't tell him where he was going when he left, but he assumed that he was going home to take care of his wife, Doris. But when he didn't come home around the time that he usually would, family started worrying.
Bill was a very regimented person. When it came to time, he was punctual.
Again, Linda Penault.
When it came to his daily routine, you could tell what his daily routine was going to be all the time. And if you didn't know, he would tell me where he was going when he left the house in the morning and I was with Doris, I'm going to the courthouse, I'm going to the town hall, I have a meeting this morning, I'll be back And you knew lunch was at noon. He would leave about 9 o'clock in the morning, 9 to 9:30 in the morning when I arrived. And he would be back home for lunch at noon. And supper was around 5 o'clock or so.
But Linda wasn't with Doris at the time of Bill Spicer's death. Linda said that she was vacationing with her family in Florida, and so one of Bill Spicer's grandchildren was looking after Doris at the time that he died.
He was very scheduled, might you say.
Again, Detective Heather Beauchamp.
And so when he did not return home at his exact time of returning home every night, the family did become worried. And of course, if he's not home, he would normally be at the tree farm. So when the tree farm was checked, he was found.
Police told us that it was his friend and cousin Phil Tuttle who ended up finding Bill Spicer dead. This came about because family was worried about where he was because he stuck to such a strict schedule and wasn't home at the time they thought he would be. So family made some calls. One of them was to Phil Tuttle, and he found Bill Spicer stabbed to death in his car and called police.
Hi, this is Phil. Leave a message and I'll get back to you.
We reached out to Phil Tuttle on multiple occasions, but he declined to take part in the podcast.
I'm just following up on a voicemail from a couple weeks ago.
We knocked on his and the doors of several of Bill Spicer's relatives, including his children and grandchildren. Some did not return calls, while others declined to be interviewed for the podcast. But Phil did speak to the day about Bill Spicer in the days after the murder. On March 18, 1995, he was quoted as saying, "He always came by at the same time. We just drank coffee, talked about this and that. I've been friends with him ever since I was a kid." From March 17, 1995, "I used to sell worms to him when I was 5 or 6, and the relationship built from there. He was like a second father to me. He was brilliant. He could carry on 5 different conversations at the same time, and he always knew what he was talking about. He could talk about anything and everything."
No matter how many faults this country's got, it is still so much better than you got anywhere else. All you have to do is go look. I think myself that all senior high school classes should be sent abroad. One of the things I stick with Rotary for is because of the youth exchange program.
Yeah.
They carry. But all you need is education. That's all.
Oh my God! Every time I see a paper, and I'm thinking, oh God, I wish that they could find the killer. You know, how could somebody that been that cruel and hurt somebody, such a nice man? How could they be out there? God knows what they're doing to other people. You know.
Shock. Shock and actually horror. That you'd have someone in the community that would commit a really violent crime like that, and on a person who would have probably gave the person what they wanted.
And all I can say is, for a person to do that to Bill, I don't think they could know him. I don't think they could know him. Anybody that knew Bill could never harm him to that degree, ever.
If you have a tip about William C. Spicer Jr.'s murder, please contact the Groton Town Police at 860-441-6716 or the New London State's Attorney's Office at 860-443-2835. If you have any questions about the Spicer case, post it on our Facebook group at facebook.com/groups/caseunsolved or email us at caseunsolved@theday.com. Next week on Case Unsolved, we'll talk about how the murder investigation unfolded over the past 23 years, from the day of the murder until now.
The attack on him was a blitz type attack.
Somebody brought the knife to the house, and that upset me.
We did find a handmade knife that was located that we believe could possibly be the weapon.
Very confusing, and everybody's pointing fingers at everybody else. And unless you have that one little bit to tie everybody together, it just went nowhere.
And we'll talk about the life Bill Spicer had outside of Groton, the life he had at his home on Foster Pond in Bridgeton, Maine.
The investigation led to there.
I know he was a controversial character.
And interviews were conducted.
Some of us believed that he was responsible for Bill's death.
Case Unsolved is produced by Peter Wappy and me, Carlos Virgen. Reporting was done by Erica Moser. Editing and audio mixing by Peter Wappy. Tim Cotter is executive producer, and Sassy Larrañeta is associate producer. I produced the music used in the series. This has been a production of The Day in New London, Connecticut.